Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for a reading of A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This video starts with an original summary and analysis of the story created by me to get around YouTube's reuse content policy on videos, so I'm calling out the timestamp for the audiobook itself. The audiobook for the short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, starts at the timestamp 34 minutes. Again, that's right about at the 34 minute mark. You can also use the YouTube chapter navigation embedded in the video and in the comment below to navigate between the different sections of the video. So in this way, the length of my original summary and analysis matches or exceeds the length of the reading, thereby adding significant commentary alongside the educational value of giving an original performance of the reading. There will be one more piece of analysis following the reading of the audiobook as well. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit. So to start, here's a summary of A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, a tale for children, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So the story begins in a nondescript village battered by continuous rain. Pelayo, who is a simple villager, is returning home after throwing crabs into the sea to clear his house of their stench. It is then, however, that he notices a strange figure lying face down in the mud of his courtyard. The figure turns out to be an old man with enormous wings. His appearance is both extraordinary and grotesque. Here's a quote. His huge buzzard wings, dirty and half-plucked, were forever entangled in the mud. Which is a little gross and definitely on the worst side of things in terms of his appearance. Pelayo's wife, Elisenda, is equally perplexed by the strange visitor. Though the wings suggest something divine, something angelic, the old man's frailty, his decrepitude, make this hard to reconcile. There's a cognitive dissonance going on there between what they think and what they've been led to believe. He's dressed like a beggar, speaks in an unintelligible language, and exudes an air of pathetic vulnerability. Their neighbor, who claims to know about angels, suggests he must be one, sent to take their sick child to heaven. Despite her certainty, the old man's disheveled state plants seeds of doubt. Then the news of the winged man spreads quickly, and soon the villagers gather at Pelayo's house to gawk at this strange creature. They treat him as an object of curiosity rather than a being deserving of respect. To resolve the mystery of this angel man, this creature is actually divine, Father Gonzaga, the local priest, is summoned. Father Gonzaga inspects the old man with a mixture of reverence but also skepticism. He is appalled by the man's earthly appearance, noting that he did not understand language of God, there's a quote from the story, and lacked the bearing of a true angel. Another quote here, nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. Father Gonzaga declares, suspecting that the man might be an impostor sent by the devil. He resolves to seek guidance from the church authorities, but this process, he warns, could take years, which is also a critique in itself and a social commentary in itself. Meanwhile, the villagers treat the old man with a cruel mix of wonder and indifference. Some throw stones at him to see if he reacts, while others prod him to stand up and use his wings. They're all badgering and bothering him, wanting him to, quote-unquote, do something. The old man, however, remains passive, enduring their humiliations with the patience of someone who has no choice but to accept his lot. Well, seeing an opportunity to profit off of this strange creature and the happenstance of it all, Pelayo and Elisenda decide to confine the old man in a chicken coop and charge admission to view him. Crowds flock from distant villages to see the, quote, greatest attraction of the time. paying to witness the winged man in his squalid enclosure. Marquez describes the frenzy of the spectacle with biting irony, as the villagers behave like tourists at a sideshow. The old man's misery grows as the crowds become increasingly invasive. They throw food at him as if he weren't a supernatural creature, but a circus animal, quote from the story, and some even pluck his feathers for souvenirs. His pathetic condition, including his, quote, unbearable smell of the outdoors, diminishes whatever awe or reverence the villagers might have initially felt. Despite the exploitation, the couple's fortunes improve dramatically. With the money they earn, they build a large house with, quote, iron bars for the windows so that angels wouldn't get in, signifying their total rejection of the old man's mysterious presence and any chance of the actual divine entering their home. Elisenda views him not as a blessing, but as an annoyance, lamenting, quote, it's awful living in that hell full of angels. The villagers eventually lose interest in the old man when a new spectacle arrives. A woman who had been transformed into a giant spider as punishment for disobeying her parents. Unlike the old man, whose purpose and origin remain inscrutable, the Spider-Woman's story provides a clear moral lesson. Márquez writes that her plight is easier for the village to grasp because, quote, her fearsome shape had a certain human truth and with a hellish lesson for the children. This shift in attention underscores the human tendency to favor narratives that fit neatly into their worldview over ambiguous, unknowable phenomena. Over time, the old man becomes increasingly decrepit, his wings shedding feathers, and his body succumbing to age and neglect. However, as the seasons change, he begins to recover. His feathers regrow, and he gradually regains his strength. Despite this, Pelayo and Elisenda remain indifferent to his plight, treating him as nothing more than a nuisance they wish to be rid of. One day, however, Elisenda watches the old man awkwardly attempting to fly. After several failed attempts, he finally lifts off the ground. Márquez describes his ascent in vivid detail. Quote, he was on the point of knocking the house down with the ungainly flapping of his wings, but he managed to gain altitude. The old man soars higher and higher until he disappears into the horizon. Elisenda, watching his departure, feels no gratitude or awe, but only relief. She thinks to herself, quote, he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea. So, now that we've had a summary of the story, let's talk about some key points of analysis of what the story is trying to tell us, how can we better understand it, what are some key points and ideas within it, and a good place to start in any story is analyzing place as character, because place, setting, tells us a lot about what a story is trying to tell us. So, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the setting transcends its role as a mere backdrop and becomes an active participant in the narrative. The story's coastal village, battered by rain and swarming with crabs, is as alive as the characters themselves, shaping the events and reflecting the mood of the story. Through vivid imagery and symbolic elements, Márquez imbues the place with personality, aligning it with the story's themes of faith, human indifference, and the tension between the mundane and the extraordinary. So, in terms of the coastal village as a living entity, the story opens in a village, quote, stuck in the mud, literally and metaphorically. Márquez paints a grim picture of a place ravaged by nature, quote, the world had been sad since Tuesday. The sea and the sky were a single ash-gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. This description of the natural environment establishes an atmosphere of decay and despair, mirroring the villagers' poverty and narrow worldview. The relentless rain and infestation of crabs are not merely environmental details, but active forces that drive the story. The crab stench pushes Pelayo into the courtyard, leading to the discovery of the old man. Here, the setting directly catalyzes the central event, suggesting that the place is a character with its own agency. The oppressive environment also reinforces the story's themes. The, quote, sad world reflects the villagers' emotional and spiritual barrenness. Despite their fascination with the old man, they are incapable of recognizing his potential divinity, treating him instead as a spectacle. The bleakness of the village becomes a metaphor for their inability to transcend their circumstances or embrace the miraculous. The chicken coop also becomes a symbolic space, because once the old man is confined, the chicken coop becomes a key setting that highlights the villagers' treatment of the extraordinary. Márquez writes, quote, "They threw him things to eat through the openings in the wire, as if he weren't a supernatural creature, but a circus animal." The chicken coop, a space meant for animals, becomes a cage for the divine, symbolizing the villagers' inability to understand or respect the otherworldly. Its filthy, cramped conditions emphasize their indifference and cruelty. The coop also reflects the villagers' limited perspective. They contain what they do not understand rather than seeking to engage with it. Moreover, over time, the chicken coop deteriorates along with the old man's health. When it collapses, the narrative subtly shifts as the old man begins his journey towards recovery and eventually freedom. The coop's destruction can be seen as a breaking of the villagers' oppressive hold over him, reinforcing the idea of place as both a physical and symbolic force. The house and village can also be viewed as transformative spaces. Pelayo in Elisenda's home transforms from a humble shack into a symbol of wealth and materialism due to the profits they earned from exploiting the old man. Márquez notes, quote, "With the money they saved, they built a 2-story mansion with balconies and gardens and high netting so that crabs wouldn't get in during the winter, and with iron bars in the windows so that angels wouldn't get in." This description highlights the irony of their transformation. While their home becomes a luxurious fortress, it also becomes a space of spiritual emptiness. The, quote, iron bars to keep out angels symbolize their rejection of the miraculous and their focus on earthly concerns. The village as a whole also serves as a character that evolves throughout the story. It is initially a place of collective curiosity, with villagers flocking to see the old man. However, as their interest wanes, the village becomes indifferent, turning its attention to the Spider Woman. The place's personality, shaped by its inhabitants, shifts from fascination to boredom, reflecting humanity's fleeting engagement with the extraordinary. The sea can also be seen as a symbol for freedom. The sea, described as a, quote, horizon of the sea, serves as a contrast to the claustrophobic spaces of the village and the chicken coop. It represents a vast and noble world beyond the confines of the villagers' narrow lives. When the old man finally flies away, the sea becomes a setting for his escape. Quote, "He was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea." The sea here can emphasize liberation and transcendence. As the old man ascends into the sky and disappears into the horizon, the story leaves behind the constricting world of the village and embraces the boundless possibilities of the unknown. In terms of some scholarly perspectives of place in the stories, scholars have often noted the centrality of space in A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. In her essay, The Miracle of the Mundane, Place in Márquez's Magical Realism, literary critic Maria C. Rivera argues that the village serves as a microcosm of human society. She writes, "Márquez's village is not just a setting, but a reflection of humanity's universal flaws, our inability to recognize the divine, our obsession with material gain, and our fleeting attention spans. The decaying environment mirrors the spiritual decay of the villagers themselves." Similarly, in Magic in the Margins, Place and the Everyday in Garcia Marquez's fiction, scholar James T. Lowell emphasizes how the physical spaces in the story, such as the chicken coop and the house, serve symbolic function. Lowell contends, the chicken coop is emblematic of humanity's tendency to contain and diminish the extraordinary. It is both a literal prison for the angel and a metaphorical cage for the villagers' imaginations. The eventual destruction of the coop signals a rare moment of transcendence, but only for the angel, not for those who imprisoned him. Finally, in spatial symbolism in Latin American literature, Ana Lucia Martinez highlights the dichotomy between the village and the sea. She argues, the village represents the limits of human understanding, a space where the extraordinary is trivialized and exploited. In contrast, the sea is a liminal space, representing freedom, escape, and the infinite possibilities of existence. The angel's departure towards the horizon signifies a return to the realm of the unknowable. So, therefore, place is more than just a backdrop in this story. It's an active character in itself that shapes the narrative and reflects the story's central themes, from the impressive rain-soaked village to the symbolic chicken coop and the liberating sea. The settings are imbued with tons of meaning. Through this purposeful use of place, Marquez critiques humanity's inability to appreciate the miraculous and challenges readers to reconsider their relationship with the extraordinary. So while we are on the topic of character analysis, let's analyze our actual characters that we have in this story. And this is important to consider because A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings features a cast of characters who, though seemingly ordinary, represent broader aspects of human nature, society, and morality. From the enigmatic old man with wings to the opportunistic villagers, each character serves as a lens through which Marquez critiques human behavior and our response to the extraordinary. The titular character, the old man, is introduced as a baffling figure lying in Pelayo and Elisenda's courtyard. Marquez's description paints a stark picture of his decrepitude. Quote, "He was dressed like a rag picker. There were only a few faded hairs left on his bald skull and very few teeth in his mouth, and his pitiful condition of a drenched great-grandfather had taken away any sense of grandeur he might have had." Despite his extraordinary wings, the old man appears frail and entirely human, a juxtaposition that challenges the villagers' and readers' expectations of the divine. His wings, described as, quote, "huge buzzard wings, dirty and half-plucked," further emphasize his earthbound, pitiable state. This contradiction makes him an enigma, blurring the lines between human and angelic, mundane and miraculous. The old man's silence and passivity intensify his mystery. He does not explain his presence, defend himself, or even respond to the villagers' cruelty. His indifference to their prodding, mockery, and exploitation reveals a quiet resilience. Marquez writes, "He seemed to know everything about life and death," suggesting that his wisdom lies beyond human understanding. However, this inscrutability frustrates the villagers who expect divine beings to conform to their expectations. The old man's suffering at the hands of the villagers highlights their lack of compassion and inability to recognize the sacred in the mundane, the divine in the everyday existence. They treat him as a spectacle, throwing stones at him, poking him with sticks, and imprisoning him in a chicken coop. Yet, despite their treatment, he remains a passive figure, enduring their cruelty without protest. This endurance invokes a Christ-like image of suffering. Though Marquez subverts this trope by making the old man unremarkable in every other way. So Pelayo and Elisenda can be viewed as practical exploiters, people who exploit the situation. Pelayo and Elisenda, the couple who discover the old man, are initially perplexed by his presence, but they quickly shift their focus to pragmatic, that is, practical concerns. Pelayo is a simple and superstitious man, and initially he wants to put the old man out to sea in a raft with provisions, a solution that demonstrates his lack of empathy and his desire to avoid dealing with the unknown. Elisenda, on the other hand, sees an opportunity for financial gain, suggesting they charge admission for people to see the old man. Quote, "Then they found the whole neighborhood in front of the chicken coop, throwing things at the angel, and they decided to fence in the yard and charge 5 cents admission to see him. Their exploitation of the old man transforms their lives materially. Marquez writes that they build a large house with iron bars on the windows so that angels wouldn't get in, symbolizing their rejection of the miraculous after profiting from it. Elisenda, in particular, grows resentful of the old man's presence, referring to him as an annoyance. Her final relief at his departure, quote, "It's awful living in that hell full of angels," reflects her inability to appreciate his significance or view him as anything other than a burden. Pelayo and Elisenda embody the human tendency to prioritize materialism over spirituality and morality. Their treatment of the old man reveals their selfishness and inability to recognize the divine. amidst the mundane, yet again, right? It's the theme that keeps coming up. So when we look at the villagers as characters, the villagers collectively represent humanity's response to the extraordinary when it's right in front of them, oscillating between awe and cruelty, reverence and indifference. Initially, they're fascinated by the old man, flocking to Pelayo and Elisenda's house to see him. However, their fascination quickly turns exploitative. Márquez notes, quote, "They burned his side with an iron for branding steers, because he was motionless for so many hours that they thought he was dead." Their actions reflect a mixture of ignorance and fear as they attempt to impose their understanding of the world onto the old man. Their shifting attention from the old man to the Spider-Woman underscores their shallow engagement with the miraculous. The Spider-Woman, with her clear moral story, is easier for them to comprehend than the ambiguous figure of the old man. Márquez writes, quote, "Her fearsome shape had a certain human truth, highlighting their preference for simple narratives over complex, unknowable phenomena." In terms of Father Gonzaga, the local priest, who is tasked with determining whether the old man is truly an angel, despite his religious position, he is skeptical and relies on institutional protocols to validate the old man's divinity. He observes that the old man lacks the, quote, "proud dignity of angels," and does not speak Latin, leading him to doubt the old man's celestial origins. Quote, "The priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God or know how to greet his ministers." Father Gonzaga's skepticism reflects the limitation of institutionalized religion, which prioritizes rules and appearances over faith and compassion. His reliance on church authorities to assess the old man, despite the villagers' immediate need for guidance, underscores the bureaucracy and detachment of organized religion. So here's what some literary scholars have to say on the characters in Márquez's story. So Harold Bloom says in Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the Aesthetics of the Marvelous, Bloom argues that the old man functions as a, quote, "symbol of the divine's irreconcilability with human comprehension." He writes, quote, "The angel's decrepit state forces readers to confront the tension between their expectations of the divine and its often inexplicable reality. His silence and passivity highlights humanity's failure to engage with the miraculous on its own terms." In Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Man and His Work, Bel Viada discusses the moral failings of the villagers and the couple. Quote, "Pelayo and Elisenda's treatment of the old man reflects a universal tendency to exploit the extraordinary for personal gain. Their material success stands in stark contrast to their spiritual impoverishment. A critique Marquez levels not just at individuals, but at modern society as a whole." Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself commented on the story in interviews, emphasizing its satirical elements. He noted, "I wanted to show how people are capable of turning a miracle into something mundane. The angel is treated not as a divine being, but as a commodity. And that is a reflection of how society deals with the extraordinary." Another source is in her essay, Magical Realism and the Angel's Body. Alvarez Borland explores the old man's body as the site of meaning. Quote, "The angel's wings symbolize both the miraculous and the grotesque, challenging readers to reconsider their assumptions about beauty and divinity. His body becomes a battleground for the villagers' fears, hopes, and moral shortcomings." So when we look at all these characters and a very old man with enormous wings, they serve as a rich tapestry through which Márquez explores themes of faith, morality, and human nature. From the enigmatic old man, who defies easy interpretation, to the exploitative Pelayo and Elisenda, and the cruel, fickle villagers. Each character reflects the humanity's flaws and potential. Scholars like Harold Bloom, Belviada have underscored their symbolic and allegorical dimensions of the characters, while Márquez himself highlighted their satirical intent. So overall, right, these characters create a very profound story that is unsettling, forcing readers to confront their own responses to their extraordinary. So, while we are on the topic of all these interesting elements with character, as we can see, the idea of thematic elements keep coming up as well. So let's talk about some of these thematic elements and key themes of the story. So, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, explores themes of human nature, faith, suffering, and the interplay between the ordinary and the extraordinary. And through magical realism, which is a genre that Marquez is very well known for, Marquez juxtaposes the fantastical and the mundane to probe questions about human behavior, morality, and belief. So, let's look at some of these themes. So let's talk about human nature and the treatment of the quote-unquote other. A central theme of the story is the human tendency to marginalize and exploit those who are different or inexplicable. When Pelayo and Elisenda first discover the old man, his otherworldly wings should evoke awe, but instead they are met with fear, suspicion, and concern. Quote, "They simply stared at him in astonishment. Without daring to touch him, they thought he was a lonely castaway from some foreign ship wrecked by the storm." This initial reaction, one of cautious, practical distance, reflects the villagers' inability to embrace the miraculous. Rather than considering the old man's divine nature, they reduce him to a mere castaway. This diminishment of his potential significance underscores humanity's resistance to the unknown. As the story progresses, the villagers' treatment of the old man grows increasingly dehumanizing. Marquez describes their actions. Quote, "They burned his side with an iron for branding steers because he was motionless for so many hours that they thought he was dead." This act of cruelty epitomizes their disregard for the old man's dignity and suffering. By branding him like an animal, they strip him of his humanity and reduce him to a spectacle, a phenomenon that can be controlled and understood through violence. The old man's passivity in the face of such treatment magnifies the villagers' moral shortcomings, forcing readers to confront the darker aspects of human nature. Another theme is faith, doubt, and the miraculous. Faith and its erosion are key themes in the story, as the old man's ambiguous nature challenges the villagers' religious and cultural beliefs. Father Gonzaga, the village priest, is emblematic of the institutional religion, which relies on rigid structures and rules. When he first encounters the old man, he doubts his divinity based on superficial criteria. Quote, "The priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God or know how to greet his minister." Father Gonzaga's skepticism reveals the limitations of organized religion, which often prioritizes dogma and bureaucracy over spiritual wonder. His reliance on the church hierarchy to determine the old man's status highlights the bureaucracy of faith, contrasting sharply with the villagers' initially unstructured, if misguided, reverence for the old man. The old man's existence blurs the line between the miraculous and the mundane. Márquez's description of his wings encapsulates this tension between those elements. Quote, "The wings were dirty and half-plucked, forever entangled in the mud." The imagery of the wings, soiled and earthbound, undermines traditional notions of angelic beauty and divinity. Instead of inspiring awe, the old man's appearance confounds expectations, forcing the villagers and readers to grapple with the idea that miracles may not align with preconceived ideals. This theme resonates throughout the story, challenging both characters and readers to reconsider what constitutes the divine. Exploitation and materialism is another theme. Pelayo and Elisenda's treatment of the old man exemplifies humanity's tendency to exploit the extraordinary for personal gain. Upon realizing that the old man can be turned into a profitable attraction, they build a chicken coop and charge admission to see him. Quote, "The only thing that made them keep their hopes up was the idea that he might be promoted to the rank of full-fledged angel, and that they may charge him so much per miracle." This commodification of the miraculous underscores the couple's materialism and lack of moral integrity. Their willingness to capitalize, that is, make money on the old man's suffering, highlights their greed and short-sightedness. As they grow wealthier, their attitudes towards the old man become even more dismissive. Elisenda's final sentiment about the man with enormous wings is, "It's awful living in that hell full of angels," which reveals her ingratitude and her inability to appreciate the source of their newfound prosperity. The irony of her statement lies in her rejection of the miraculous, even as she profits from it, reflecting a broader critique of society's prioritization of material gain over spiritual or moral growth. Another key theme is of suffering and endurance. Suffering is a pervasive theme in the story embodied most poignantly by the old man. His decrepit physical state, described as that of a, quote, a drenched grandfather, makes him a pitiful figure, and despite the villagers' cruelty, he endures their abuse with quiet resilience. Márquez writes, quote, he tolerated the most ingenious infamies with the patience of a dog who had no illusions. This comparison to a dog underscores the old man's humility and endurance. His silence in the face of suffering elevates him to a Christ-like figure, though Márquez subverts this comparison by emphasizing his ordinariness. The theme of suffering extends to the villagers as well, who are trapped in a cycle of poverty and superstition. The arrival of the old man momentarily disrupts their lives, offering the possibility of transformation, but their inability to recognize the miraculous leaves them unchanged. In the end, it is the old man who is freed, flying away towards the horizon, while the villagers remain mired in their mundane existence. Another theme is the ordinary versus the extraordinary. Márquez's blending of magical realism, which again is basically the mundanity, the everyday quality of magic in everyday real life. So Márquez's blending of magical realism and everyday life creates a tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary, which is a hallmark of his style. The old man's arrival, though fantastical, is treated with pragmatism, that is practicality, by the villagers. Quote, the neighbor woman who knew everything about life and death said he was an angel. The neighbor woman's matter-of-fact declaration exemplifies how the extraordinary is seamlessly integrated into the villagers' worldview, yet their subsequent actions, poking, prodding, and imprisoning the old man, reveal their inability to engage meaningfully with the miraculous. The juxtaposition of the Spider-Woman, a carnival attraction, with the old man further explores this theme. Márquez writes, quote, her only nourishment came from the meatballs that charitable souls chose to toss into her mouth. The villager's preference for the Spider-Woman's straightforward morality tale over the old man's inscrutable presence reflects their need for simplicity and the rejection of the mysterious. In this way, Márquez critiques humanity's tendency to reduce the extraordinary to the comprehensible. Here's some scholarly perspectives on themes. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the man in his work, Belviada argues that the story critiques modern materialism and spiritual indifference. Quote, the old man is a tragic figure of the miraculous reduced to spectacle, his divine nature lost amidst the villagers' greed and cruelty. Harold Bloom emphasizes the story's exploration of faith and doubt, writing in Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the Aesthetics of the Marvelous, quote, Marquez challenges readers to confront the dissonance between the sacred and the profane, the divine and the human. The villager's treatment of the old man is emblematic of humanity's inability to grapple with the inexplicable. Gabriel Garcia Marquez himself described his story as a satire on human behavior, noting in an interview, quote, I wanted to show how people can turn even the most miraculous thing into something ordinary, something to be used, abused, and forgotten. In Magical Realism and the Angel's Body, Isabel Alvarez Borland writes, quote, the old man's wings symbolize both transcendence and decay, a duality that forces villagers and readers to reconsider their understanding of divinity and humanity. So through these themes of human nature, faith, exploitation, suffering, and the interplay between the ordinary and extraordinary, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings offers a rich critique of societal values and human behavior. Márquez's use of magical realism, coupled with his incisive exploration of these themes, creates a story that is both timeless and deeply resonant. Scholarly interpretations and Márquez's own reflections further highlight to us the profound insights embedded in this deceptively simple tale, inviting readers to confront their own responses to the miraculous and the unknown. Now, here we are at our audiobook portion of the video for a reading of
A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, a Tale for Children.
Written by
Gabriel Garcia Marquez. On the third day of rain, they had killed so many crabs inside the house that Pelayo had to cross his drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea, because the newborn child had a temperature all night, and they thought it was due to the stench. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Sea and sky were a single ash-gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. The light was so weak at noon that when Pelayo was coming back to the house after throwing away the crabs, it was hard for him to see what it was that was moving and groaning in the rear of the courtyard. He had to go very close to see that it was an old man, a very old man, lying face down in the mud, who, in spite of his tremendous efforts, couldn't get up, impeded by his enormous wings. Frightened by that nightmare, Pelayo ran to get to Elisenda, his wife, who was putting compresses on the sick child, and he took her to the rear of the courtyard. They both looked at the fallen body with mute stupor. He was dressed like a rag picker. There were only a few faded hairs left on his bald skull, and very few teeth in his mouth, and his pitiful condition of a drenched great-grandfather had taken away any sense of grandeur he might have had. His huge buzzard wings, dirty and half-plucked, were forever entangled in the mud. They looked at him so long and so closely that Pelayo and Elisenda very soon overcame their surprise, and in the end found him familiar. Then they dared to speak to him, and he answered in an incomprehensible dialect with a strong sailor's voice. That was how they skipped over the inconvenience of the wings and quite intelligently concluded that he was a lonely castaway from some foreign ship wrecked by the storm. And yet they called in a neighbor woman who knew everything about life and death to see him, and all she needed was one look to show them their mistake. "He's an angel," she told them. "He must have been coming for the child, but the poor fellow is so old that the rain knocked him down." On the following day, everyone knew that a flesh-and-blood angel was held captive in Pelayo's house. Against the judgment of the wise neighbor woman, for whom angels in those times were the fugitive survivors of a celestial conspiracy, they did not have the heart to club him to death. Pelayo watched over him all afternoon from the kitchen, armed with his bailiff's club, and before going to bed, he dragged him out of the mud and locked him up with the hens in the wired chicken coop. In the middle of the night, when the rain stopped, Pelayo and Elisenda were still killing crabs. Then they felt magnanimous and decided to put the angel on a raft with fresh water and provisions for 3 days and leave him to his fate on the high seas. But when they went out into the courtyard with the first light of dawn, they found the whole neighborhood in front of the chicken coop having fun with the angel, without the slightest reverence, tossing him things to eat through the openings in the wire as if he weren't a supernatural creature, but a circus animal. Father Gonzaga arrived before 7 o'clock, alarmed at the strange news. By that time, onlookers less frivolous than those at dawn had already arrived, and they were making all kinds of conjectures concerning the captive's future. The simplest among them thought that he should be named the mayor of the world. Others of sterner mind felt that he should be promoted to the rank of 5-star general in order to win all wars. Some visionaries hoped that he could be put to stud in order to implant on Earth a race of winged wise men who could take charge of the universe. But Father Gonzaga, before becoming a priest, had been a robust woodcutter. Standing by the wire, he reviewed his catechism in an instant and asked them to open the door so that he could take a close look at that pitiful man who looked more like a decrepit hen among the fascinated chickens. He was lying in a corner drying his open wings in the sunlight among the fruit peels and breakfast leftovers that the early risers had thrown at him. Alien to the impertinences of the world, he only lifted his antiquarian eyes and murmured something in his dialect when Father Gonzaga went into the chicken coop and said good morning to him in Latin. The parish priest had his first suspicion of an impostor when he saw that he did not understand the language of God or know how to greet his ministers. Then he noticed that seen close up he was much too human. He had an unbearable smell of the outdoors, the backside of his wings was strewn with parasites, and his main feathers had been mistreated by terrestrial winds, and nothing about him measured up to the proud dignity of angels. Then he came out of the chicken coop, and in a brief sermon warned the curious against the risk of being ingenuous. He reminded them that the devil had the bad habit of making use of carnival tricks in order to confuse the unwary. He argued that if wings were not the essential element in determining the difference between a hawk and an airplane, they were even less so in the recognition of angels. Nevertheless, he promised to write a letter to his bishop so that the latter would write to his primate, so that the latter would write to the supreme pontiff in order to get the final verdict from the highest courts. His prudence fell on sterile hearts. The news of the captive angel spread with such rapidity that after a few hours the courtyard had the bustle of a marketplace, and they had to call in troops with fixed bayonets to disperse the mob that was about to knock the house down. Elisenda, her spine all twisted from sweeping up so much marketplace trash, then got the idea of fencing in the yard and charging 5 cents admission to see the angel. The curious came from far away. A traveling carnival arrived with a flying acrobat who buzzed over the crowd several times, but no one paid any attention to him because his wings were not those of an angel, but rather those of a sidereal bat. The most unfortunate invalids on earth came in search of health. A poor woman who since childhood had been counting her heartbeats and had run out of numbers, a Portuguese man who couldn't sleep because the noise of the stars disturbed him, a sleepwalker who got up at night to undo the things he had done while awake, and many others with less serious ailments. In the midst of that shipwreck disorder that made the earth tremble, Pelayo and Elisenda were happy with fatigue, for in less than a week they had crammed their rooms with money, and the line of pilgrims waiting their turn to enter still reached beyond the horizon. The angel was the only one who took no part in his own act. He spent his time trying to get comfortable in his borrowed nest, befuddled by the hellish heat of the oiled lamps and sacramental candles that had been placed along the wire. At first they tried to make him eat some mothballs, which, according to the wisdom of the wise neighbor woman, were the food prescribed for angels. But he turned them down just as he turned down the papal lunches that the penitents brought him, and they never found out whether it was because he was an angel or because he was an old man that in the end he ate nothing but eggplant mush. His only supernatural virtue seemed to be patience, especially during the first days, when the hens pecked at him searching for the stellar parasites that proliferated in his wings, and the cripples pulled out feathers to touch their defective parts with, and even the most merciful threw stones at him, trying to get him to rise so they could see him standing. The only time they succeeded in arousing him was when they burned his side with an iron for branding steers, for he had been motionless for so many hours that they had thought he was dead. He awoke with a start, ranting in his hermetic language and with tears in his eyes, and he flapped his wings a couple of times, which brought on the whirlwind of chicken dung and lunar dust and a gale of panic that did not seem to be of this world. Although many thought that his reaction had been not one of rage, but of pain, from then on they were careful not to annoy him, because the majority understood that his passivity was not that of a hero taking his ease, but that of a cataclysm in repose. Father Gonzaga held back the crowd's frivolity with formulas of maid-servant inspiration while awaiting the arrival of final judgment on the nature of the captive. But the mail from Rome showed no sense of urgency. They spent their time finding out if the prisoner had a navel, if his dialect had any connection with Aramaic, how many times he could fit on the head of a pin, or whether he wasn't just a Norwegian with wings. Those meager letters might have come and gone until the end of time if a providential event had not put an end to the priest's tribulations. It so happened that during those days, among so many other carnival attractions, there arrived in town the traveling show of the woman who had been changed into a spider for having disobeyed her parents. The admission to see her was not only less than the admission to see the angel, but people were permitted to ask her all manner of questions about her absurd state, and to examine her up and down so that no one would ever doubt the truth of her horror. She was a frightful tarantula, the size of a ram and with the head of a sad maiden. What was most heartrending, however, was not her outlandish shape, but the sincere affliction with which she recounted the details of her misfortune. While still practically a child, she had sneaked out of her parents' house to go to a dance, and while she was coming back through the woods after having danced all night without permission, a fearful thunderclap rent the sky, and through the crack came the lightning bolt of brimstone that changed her into a spider. Her only nourishment came from the meatballs that charitable souls chose to toss into her mouth. A spectacle like that, full of so much human truth and with such a fearful lesson, was bound to defeat without even trying that of a haughty angel who scarcely deigned to look at mortals. Besides, the few miracles attributed to the angel showed a certain mental disorder, like the blind man who didn't recover his sight but grew 3 new teeth, or the paralytic who didn't get to walk but almost won the lottery, and the leper whose sores sprouted sunflowers. Those consolation miracles, which were more like mocking fun, had already ruined the angel's reputation when the woman who had been changed into a spider finally crushed him completely. That was how Father Gonzaga was cured forever of his insomnia, and Pelayo's courtyard went back to being as empty as during the time it had rained for 3 days and crabs walked through the bedrooms. The owner of the house had no reason to lament. With the money they saved, they built a 2-story mansion with balconies and gardens and high netting so the crabs wouldn't get in during the winter time, and with iron bars on the windows so that angels wouldn't get in. Pelayo also set up a rabbit warren close to town and gave up his job as bailiff for good, and Elisenda brought some satin pumps with high heels and many dresses of iridescent silk, the kind worn on Sunday by the most desirable women in those times. The chicken coop was the only thing that didn't receive any attention. If they washed it down with crayoline and burned tiers of mirror inside it every so often, it was not an homage to the angel, but to drive away the dung-heap stench that still hung everywhere like a ghost and was turning the new house into an old one. At first, when the child learned to walk, they were careful that he not get too close to the chicken coop. But then they began to lose their fears and got used to the smell, and before the child got his second teeth, he'd gone inside the chicken coop to play, where the wires were falling apart. The angel was no less standoffish with him than with other mortals, but he tolerated the most ingenious infamies with the patience of a dog who had no illusions. They both came down with the chicken pox at the same time. The doctor who took care of the child couldn't resist the temptation to listen to the angel's heart, and he found so much whistling in the heart and so many sounds in his kidneys that it seemed impossible for him to be alive. What surprised him most, however, was the logic of his wings. They seemed so natural on that completely human organism that he couldn't understand why other men didn't have them too. When the child began school, it had been some time since the sun and rain had caused the collapse of the chicken coop. The angel went dragging himself about here and there like a stray, dying man. They would drive him out of the bedroom with a broom and a moment later find him in the kitchen. He seemed to be in so many places at the same time that they grew to think that he'd been duplicated, that he was reproducing himself all through the house, and the exasperated and unhinged Elisenda shouted that it was awful living in that hell full of angels. He could scarcely eat, and his antiquarian eyes had also become so foggy that he went about bumping into posts. All he had left were the bare cannulae of his last feathers. Pelayo threw a blanket over him and extended him the charity of letting him sleep in the shed, and only then did they notice that he had a temperature at night and was delirious with tongue twisters of an old Norwegian. That was one of the few times they became alarmed, for they thought he was going to die, and not even the wise neighbor woman had been able to tell them what to do with dead angels. And yet he not only survived his worst winter, but seemed improved with the first sunny days. He remained motionless for several days in the farthest corner of the courtyard, where no one would see him, and at the beginning of December some large, stiff feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of a scarecrow, which looked more like another misfortune or decrepitude. But he must have known the reason for those changes, for he was quite careful that no one should notice him, that no one should hear the sea shanties that he sometimes sang under the stars. One morning Elisenda was cutting some bunches of onions for lunch when a wind that seemed to come from the high seas blew into the kitchen. Then she went to the window and caught the angel in his first attempts at flight. They were so clumsy that his fingernails opened a furrow in the vegetable patch, and he was on the point of knocking the shed down with the ungainly flapping that slipped on the light and couldn't get a grip on the air. But he did manage to gain altitude. Elisenda let out a sigh of relief, for herself and for him, when he saw him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in some way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. She kept watching him, even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea.
So, now that we've read the story together, summarized the story, and analyzed some of the key components of the story, let's talk about how A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings fits into Gabriel Garcia Marquez's broader works. So, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings exemplifies many of the recurring themes, narrative techniques, and stylistic elements that define his broader literary body of work. It is a cornerstone of his exploration of magical realism and reflects his ongoing fascination with the intersection of the extraordinary and the mundane, the critique of social hierarchies, and the nature of human suffering. Scholars, and Márquez himself, have often commented on how the story fits into the broader tapestry of his writing, particularly as a precursor to his magnum opus, 100 Years of Solitude. So in terms of the magical realism of everyday life, magical realism is perhaps Márquez's most famous contribution to the world of literature, and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings is a quintessential example of this technique. In the story, the fantastical presence of an angel is treated with the same mundane practicality as the rainstorm that ushers him in. This seamless blending of the extraordinary and the ordinary is central to Márquez's body of work. In an interview, Márquez described his approach to magical realism. In Latin America, surrealism runs through the streets. Reality is extraordinary and fantastical by its very nature. Scholars have noted how this perspective permeates his work. Jean H. Bell Viada and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Man in His Works, writes, Márquez's magical realism bridges the gap between folklore and modernity, between the tangible and the intangible. A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings serves as an early model for his ability to make the supernatural feel deeply human. And this theme is echoed in 100 Years of Solitude, where magical elements, such as the levitating priest or remedios, the beauty ascending to heaven, are presented as integral parts of daily life. Despite their magical quality, they're just taken as normal. The old man with wings in this story functions similarly, existing in a liminal space between the miraculous and the mundane, the everyday, the divine and the everyday, which reflects Márquez's broader worldview. In terms of social critique and satire, many of Márquez's works critique societal structures and human behavior, and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings is no exception. The story satirizes how society reacts to the extraordinary, with exploitation, indifference, and a preference for spectacle over substance. Márquez's critique of materialism and moral decay is a recurring theme in his fiction. In The Autumn of the Patriarch, for example, Márquez explores the corruption of power, while in Chronicle of a Death Foretold, he dissects collective apathy and moral failure. Similarly, in A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the villagers' treatment of the angels mirrors their moral shortcoming. Harold Bloom, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the Aesthetic of the Marvelous, notes, quote, Marquez consistently uses his narrative to hold a mirror up to humanity, revealing its pettiness, greed, and inability to grasp the sublime. The villager's obsession with the Spider-Woman over the angel encapsulates humanity's preference for simplistic, digestible narratives over the complexity of the divine. Márquez himself commented on the story's satirical nature, quote, the angel is a symbol of how people treat miracles. They see them, use them, and then forget them. It's commentary on how society devalues what it doesn't understand. And so this theme of exploitation is central to Márquez's broader critique of modernity, a concern also present in Love in the Time of Cholera, where societal structures stifle personal relationships and spirituality. The theme of suffering and endurance, embodied by the old man, is also a hallmark of Márquez's storytelling. In A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the angel silently endures the villager's cruelty, much like other Márquez characters endure hardship without understanding or resolution. The image of the old man recalls Márquez's larger body of work, where suffering is often depicted as an intrinsic part of existence. For example, in 100 Years of Solitude, the Buendia family endures endless cycles of tragedy and misfortune, highlighting the inevitability of human suffering. Isabel Alvarez Borland, in the narrative of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, explains, quote, the old man's silent endurance serves as an allegory for the marginalized and oppressed in society. Márquez repeatedly crafts characters whose suffering goes unnoticed or is misunderstood, forcing readers to confront the moral failures of humanity. And Márquez himself connected the angel's suffering to broader questions about human morality. Quote, he says, the angel is a mirror of humanity's treatment of the weak, the poor, and misunderstood. His suffering is meant to make us uncomfortable because it reflects our own behavior. And this theme resonates in Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where Santiago Nazar is brutally murdered while the entire town watches, and in Evil Hour, where societal gossip and cruelty lead to violence and disarray. Another defining feature of Marquez's work is his insistence that the extraordinary is a natural part of life, particularly in Latin America. A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings exemplifies this worldview by presenting the angel not as a supernatural event, but as an unremarkable part of daily life, again harkening back to the style of magical realism as well. Marquez explained the perspective in an interview. Marquez said, quote, "The fantastic is part of the everyday in Latin America. Angels, ghosts, and miracles are not extraordinary. They are part of the air we breathe." This philosophy is central to 100 Years of Solitude, where magical events occur alongside mundane life without fanfare, without a big deal, right? It's just part of the daily life, is these magical qualities. That is what magical realism is. The story setting, the fictional town of Macondo, becomes a microcosm for Marquez's understanding of the world as a place where the extraordinary and the ordinary coexist seamlessly. As literary critic Roberto González Echeverria notes in The Pilgrim at Home, quote, "Marquez creates a world where the marvelous is not a departure from reality, but an extension of it. The angel, in A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, embodies this fusion, existing as both a divine being and a bedraggled earthly figure." Additionally, Marquez's works often reflect the socio-political and cultural dynamics of Latin America, and A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings is no exception to this. The villager's treatment of the old man can be read as a critique of Latin Americans' history of colonialism and exploitation. The old man, marginalized and misunderstood, mirrors the experience of indigenous and oppressed peoples. Critic Gerald Martin, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Life, emphasizes this connection. Martin writes, quote, "The angel represents the forgotten, the neglected, and the exploited in Latin American history. Marquez uses his suffering to draw attention to the moral failures of both individuals and societies." And so, when we look at A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings in the broader context of Marquez's work, it's a microcosm of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's broader literary concerns and techniques. Its use of magical realism, critique of human nature, exploration of suffering, and the fusion of the extraordinary with the mundane align closely with his major works, particularly 100 Years of Solitude. As both Marquez and literary scholars have noted, the story encapsulates his ability to hold a mirror to humanity, exposing its flaws while imbuing the ordinary with a sense of the miraculous, again, magical realism. It remains a seminal work that bridges Marquez's unique style with universal themes of morality, faith, and human behavior. If this video helped you, or if you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe to my channel. It helps me to be able to keep supporting you all. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry or summaries and analyses, please let me know in the comments. And just dropping a comment to say thanks or hi also greatly helps me out. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. Stay lit with Simply Lit.